Good morning, everyone. My name's Norman Hall, and welcome to the Star Business Solutions 2019 webinar series. Today's webinar will be on Greentree eDocs. And as usual, we have myself and Josh Diffie, who will be handling most of today's presentation. And today's agenda, we'll go through eDocs, purchase orders, AP invoices, supplier statements. We'll show you where you can get some extra demonstration videos and also do some Q&A at the end. As we're going through the presentation, please feel free to type in any questions you may have. However, we'll be holding them back to the end of the until we answer them, but write them down as you think of them. Okay, I'll now hand over to Josh, who'll go through some definitions and other information prior to starting the demonstration.
Thanks, Norman. So I thought I'd just go through a fairly simple couple of slides on what eDocs is all about, and then we'll dive on into the demonstration. So eDocs purchase orders is more than just a purchase order within Greentree. So you have the ability with eDocs to create non-traditional Greentree purchase orders. So those are ones that do not sit within the purchase order suite of Greentree, which means you can have people create purchase orders without necessarily creating or using up a distribution license. In addition to that potential option, you can of course still create your traditional purchase orders within Greentree, depending on what it is you're trying to achieve. Both the eDoc purchase orders and the purchase orders that get created or can be created can be used in subsequent steps such as eDocs AP invoices. eDocs AP invoices is all about reducing your paper flow and increasing speed and accuracy. This can be used with or without scraping, which I'll be talking to in just a moment. And that scraping can either be the entire document, both the header information and the line information, or simply just the header information. Depending on what style of invoices you receive from your suppliers, we can pick and choose the appropriate scraping option to match. And that's a best conversation to have with your primary consultant. So what is scraping? So scraping is all about reading PDFs or images or a number of other file types, finding information. So those are things like invoice numbers, ABN information, dollar amounts, line item codes, etc., and then matching that with Greentree information and creating transactions or coding transactions for you. Scraping within Greentree uses a tool called Extractor, which uses machine learning and artificial intelligence, which is a bit further and beyond what traditional OCR is all about, which is what you might be more familiar with. eDocs supplier statements is another area we'll be touching on shortly. So this allows you to import your supplier statements, potentially scraping them for information. So once again, finding the supplier, potentially finding things like what invoices are on said statement and how much their amounts are and so on, and then processing that through, reconciling it if appropriate, and matching it to all the AP invoices. This is great for those sites out there that prefer to pay off a statement rather than directly off an invoice, and you can use this process to automatically match those invoices and obviously reducing the errors of potentially double paying invoices and so on. If we have time today, we'll also take a quick look at eDocs Expense Manager, which allows you to manage expense receipts and claims. That gives you the option of employees throughout the month tracking their receipts, potentially coding them, or having finance or a clerk code them. And then when it comes to the expense claim, a very easy and automated process. So what does this all look like? So I'm going to use the AP invoice as a bit of an example, but the similar concept can apply across the other types. So we get a document in. Now that can either be via an email or it can be hard copy. And that hard copy could either be something where an invoice was delivered with the goods, or maybe it was mailed in to the finance team. However that got in, as in a paper format, you can then scan that into Greentree. So for the soft copies that are emailed in, Greentree will regularly be looking at the email address that you've defined and automatically bring that within Greentree. The hard copies can either be scanned to that same email address, making the process quite quick and efficient, or alternatively, depending on your hardware, we can read from a server location. Those documents can then be sent up to Extractor in the cloud for scraping. The real benefit of using Extractor is it doesn't just look at transactions or invoices or documents that you have scraped, but also other Greentree sites as well as potentially non-Greentree sites for that machine learning. And so when it finds things like invoice numbers and purchase orders and so on, it has quite a high success rate of hitting the ground running and finding the information without training or much training required. The coding is then completed within Greentree. That can be assisted with purchase order matching or line level matching. That can be an and or depending on what type of invoices you're receiving. It is also worth pointing out that this coding completion doesn't require you can log into Greentree and just do eDocs coding, reviewing, or approvals without taking up a system manager or any other financial licenses if that is all that you are doing. The approvals can be handled directly through eDocs as well as using the standard approvals and alerts functionality. So you do have the option of potentially using email approvals, which is obviously a star module that we've developed and discussed in the past, if that is another area you would like to look at. And finally, once everything's approved, the transaction is created. So unlike a standard supplier invoice, which once entered, hits the GL straight away, and then once you potentially need to go through approval, make changes, etc., and that could potentially cross posting periods, this doesn't create a finance or financial transaction until the final process is completed. So you do have a fair bit of flexibility around when that's going to hit the GL and in which posting periods. So let's take a look. So I'm going to step through the eDocs in pretty much the same process that we've gone through so far in those slides. So I'm going to start with purchase orders, and then I'm going to dive through the subsequent ones. So let's just come in and start with the purchase order. So this, as I said before, can either be coming directly from an email address or it can be coming from a folder somewhere on the server. Now I'm going to hit the go button, but this of course would be scheduled and wouldn't be something a user would have to press, but it's a little hard to time every single scenario here without manually hitting that go button. So that's brought in a new eDoc called with a type of PO purchase order. If I double click on that and have a look, I've got my purchase order on the right hand side and my data entry on the left hand side. So a couple of key points here. This could be for those that are out in the field that potentially have more traditional purchase order books. It might be a situation where you have trade staff that are purchasing directly from places like Bunnings and such, and maybe they're purchasing on account and you want to simply take a snapshot of that receipt or that account transaction and send that through. There's a lot of different scenarios on how that may apply. So I can come in here. Now, the purchase order number may or may not be relevant at this stage. If you've got a purchase order book, then of course, we can then put in that purchase order number. But if you were simply taking a photo of an account receipt or something of the like, then you might use a different reference. Once you've selected that supplier, you'll notice that my main tab has been updated. Now this can look slightly different, supplier by supplier, but the main points of reference are the recently used. So the recently used is going to show you the line types, and in this example, it's inventory and job cost lines that I have recently used with this specific supplier, what the price was, and it will also tell me the last time I used that price or used that item. I do have the option of also seeing all the stock items that are on that supplier and potentially list a number of favorites as well. If I simply come into that recently used and I say, well, there are 20 of this item and 20 of this item, that's then keeping a total of how much the purchase order is so far, and we do have the ability of then confirming that and matching that. So this could then go through a process which might require approval, but depending on your business process, this may have already been given to a supplier, so we can then also mark it as fully received. If you do have that situation where you've picked up some goods at a trade store, then you can mark this as fully received. We won't mark it like that just at the moment. Now, at this point, I'm not going to create the purchase order because I want to give you an idea of where you can take this if you don't want to go down the path of creating purchase orders. But there is that create purchase order button right there. And let's just hit save. So that's pretty simple as far as entering a purchase orders. There's very little difference as far as a traditional purchase order. It just speeds up that data entry process and hopefully reduces those errors along the way. So now we've got the invoice come in for that purchase order. So if I just come in and hit that go button again, so that's going to find my invoice. Now this time I'm going to go through the scraping process. So you'll notice I've now got an AP invoice eDoc showing in my being scraped tile. Now, as I said before, this will go through to our cloud service called Extractor. The being scraped tile doesn't have to show on a person's workflow desk. Realistically, most people don't care about it until it's finished being scraped. But from a demonstration perspective, it does make it a little easier to show you where we're up to. And there we go. That's then come through. You'll notice it's changed to a status of ready for coding, and I can double click on it. This time, you'll notice that a whole bunch of information has been pre-filled for me. For example, the invoice number's pre-filled, the purchase order number's pre-filled, as is the supplier and the dollar amounts. Now, I've got line level matching turned on, so you'll notice that in my bottom tile here, it's showing me the 2 lines that it found on the supplier invoice. Now, before I dive too far into the processing of this transaction, I thought I'd give you a quick look at how Extractor works. So I can simply come into the display and select scraping detail. That's going to launch Extractor and go to that very specific document. So if you do have a situation where potentially on the first try of a new supplier invoice, that it's instead of finding the invoice number, it's found an order number, or instead of an invoice date, it's found a delivery date, or whatever else it might have automatically found for you. You do have the ability of coming in, selecting a field, hitting the X, or coming in and reselecting it elsewhere. I'd also like to point out at this stage, now we've used a test ABN number that that you can find just by doing a quick Google search, and you'll notice that it's told me who the supplier is. All right, so that supplier name is nowhere on this document. It's found that purely based off doing an ABN lookup. So that does hopefully, once again, reduce those errors as far as entering transactions. All that information comes back through into eDocs and gets stored. Now we can do all kinds of wonderful magic as far as that import process. So, for example, that supplier name, we could have all kinds of warnings and pop-up messages if the supplier name that Extractor found based on the ABN lookup doesn't match the supplier name you've got within Greentree. We can also find things like bank account information. So from that perspective, we can then match that with the bank account details on the supplier. Now, if I go and have a look at my eDocs purchase order tab, you'll notice there's that purchase order I created just before. If I click on it, it's going to show me the purchase order that we saw on the previous screen. Now, if I take one step back for a second, and I'm going to close that and go back to that eDocs purchase order that we created earlier, if I had generated an actual purchase order by simply hitting the Create PO button, then when I come in to do my matching, we can come in and auto match. That's going to go through and find those two lines, and on my purchase order tab, you'll notice it's then matched them. And once again, if I click on it, it'll show me the PDF or other image, depending on what format we've sent it through, right here on the screen. So once again, a nice, easy process to validate the information that it relates to. Now we have the ability of having options. So in here, you could have thresholds, maybe invoices that match purchase orders can have a certain percentage or dollar amount variance from it. Alternatively, we can make you match it to a purchase order receipt if that applies as well. Now, if I didn't previously have a purchase order, then I could have gone into things like the recently used tab and select the line. So this 17-inch LCD monitor, I could select that and select the line in recently used, and you'll notice that that selects the correct quantity and the price that matches the invoice. And I can do that for all the lines. So I can still manually match them if I don't have things like purchase orders and such. But as I said before, you do have the ability of auto matching. That will start by looking at purchase order receipts, then looking at purchase orders, and then looking at things like recently used and favorites to then match that. So let's just re-hit that auto match, and away we go. Now we can then have that go through a range of different statuses, which you have the ability of creating. But in my demonstration system, I've got things like submitted for approval, approved, rejected, and so on. So we can have that float through as well. So if I was to submit that for approval manually through here, I can select who I want it to go to. So I'm going to select Amanda and click OK. Alternatively, we can use the submit for approval button, and it can flow through approvals and alerts using whatever rules you may have set up. So if I then go look at Amanda's desktop, I can see that showing in green on her desk, because in my demonstration system, I've got it, if the purchase order matches the invoice, show it in green. So this should be a process of going, well, we've already got the purchase order in there. We know it matches. So we can either completely skip this step and auto approve it. Alternatively, it might require someone to simply come in, have a look, see the lines that were matched, potentially look at the information there, and once we're happy, create the supplier invoice. So if I come in and select Create AP Invoice, that's going to disappear from Amanda's desktop. And if I was just to bring up the supplier invoice for a second, that's been entered, been matched to the purchase order, no different to how you might currently be entering invoices against purchase orders. On my attachments, I can still see that PDF by simply double clicking. And if for whatever reason I need to get back to the original eDoc, I can press View eDoc, which will reopen this screen. Now, some of the reasons why you may reopen this screen is the audit trail. So eDocs creates an additional level of an audit trail above and beyond traditional transactions within Greentree. So if I look at this System tab, we talked a little bit earlier on the fields that it finds, but if we have a look at the actions, it'll tell us how we got here. So the very first record or action, it tells us how it got into the system. So did it come from a folder? Did it come from an email? And so on. Then it will tell us that quite a bit of information was changed. So, the document date and posting date, and then it was sent for scraping. It'll tell us that it was successfully uploaded. It then tells us the status was changed, and so on, and so on, and so on. Now, as I start to go a bit further down, you'll notice that there was line added, line deleted. So as I was clicking things on and off, I'm logged in as a super user, it was marking that down. As I submitted it to Amanda, it marked my name. And while I pretended that I was acting as Amanda's role, I was still logged in as super. So the AP invoice that was generated, once again, stamps my name. So any of the changes that we make along the way get stamped automatically. Now, you might have invoices that don't come from a purchase order. They could be things like utility bills. There could be some more GL-based transactions that you have. Now, I've got one that's just come in and once again gone off to my scraping. So I can see it sitting there as being scraped. Now, in this example, it doesn't have a purchase order number, and there's a little less information that it's to work off. I'll come through in just a moment. All right, so that's now ready for coding. So the supply has been selected, and I can see it's a $440 invoice, but nothing's been matched this time. So in this example, I can come in, I can see my invoice on the right-hand side. The supply has been selected, so similar in concept to what we went through in the previous step, and I can still get to that scraping detail if need be, but this time the tabs are severely reduced. So once again, supplier types within eDocs is key for setup, so you can define them differently supplier by supplier if need be. So being an insurance supplier, surprise, surprise, the GL accounts recently used are some insurance expense accounts. So I can simply come in and tick the lines like I did previously. Maybe it belongs to this branch or cost center, and then flow through the same process I went through in the previous steps. But obviously in this example, I'm not going to that line level matching like I maybe have done with more inventory-based transactions. Now, we do try within eDocs to really speed up that data entry process and also make it a lot easier for non-finance users to potentially be coding these transactions. So obviously things like recently used, what we call requisition types, or favorites can really reduce the amount of selections available to a user, hopefully reducing the incorrect GL accounts selected or other line types selected on an invoice. But while reducing it, we still can't get rid of all the additional options. So you'll notice that this invoice was dated quite a while in the past. So this PDF I've used quite a few times. So if I click on my advanced button, I still have the more traditional items that you might be familiar with within accounts payable invoices and other transaction types. So I can still come in and change that posting date. I can select the branch or change the branch. One of the really handy things within eDocs is it can work across companies. So if you do have multiple Greentree companies and an eDoc comes in and it was went to the incorrect email address and you wish to refile it to a different company, within standard AP invoices, you would need to probably credit note or delete that transaction and then recreate it in the other company. Within eDocs, because no financial transaction has been created, I can simply come in and say, no, this one applies to the New Zealand company. Another option that's fairly unique to eDocs, which gives you some, once again, some more benefits above and beyond standard supplier invoices, is within accounts payable, you've got the ability of course, putting transactions on hold and selecting hold codes. Now that won't be new to anyone from finance, from a Greentree perspective. But if you come in and select waiting approval, you've got the ability of coming in and selecting how much of this you're putting on hold. So within standard Greentree, that would require you to go to a separate alter hold code or hold value screen, whereas in this, I can do it all in one go on the transaction. Maybe there was a variance from the original purchase order, and so we're willing to approve the original amount. So maybe we want to put just the $40 on hold or whatever else it might be. So you've got quite a lot of options there. All right, so that's eDocs supplier invoices and eDocs purchase orders. So the next step along the run there would be AP statements. So once again, similar in concept, I simply hit that run eDoc import or have that scheduled to run on a regular basis. Now, this can also go through scraping or non-scraping depending on your requirements. So if you've got supplier statements that you wish to auto match, you can use the scraping option, or alternatively, you can just bring them in similar to how I entered that purchase order in a previous step. And let's go have a look at supplier statements. So I've got one here showing ready for coding. And as I've selected this, it said, all right, I think I know who the supplier is. Do you want me to set it automatically? So it's saying that it's found computer and parts maintenance. Are we sure? I'm going to hit yes. And then make the screen a little bigger. So that's gone through and found 4 lines. So I've got an AP invoice, an AP credit note, and 2 invoices. So in this scenario, that AP credit note is obviously something that has been previously applied to an invoice. So from that perspective, maybe that's not going to show up in my list because it was, once again, previously applied. But you'll notice that 3 lines have automatically been selected. So if I come in, I can make this a little bigger. It'll tell me how it was matched. So we've got what we call unmatched lines, probable matches, and perfect matches. So if I come in and look at this probable match, so that's been matched based on the reference, based on the date, and based on the transaction type. And we've got the ability of a couple of options around that also. Now I can come in here and put a narration if that's appropriate. But you'll notice that, all right, I've got my amount down the bottom. So if I come in and confirm that, one too many ones. That's then now marked that as green. And I've got the option of marking that as reconciled. Now, once again, we can go through an approval process here if need be. Maybe the dollar amounts didn't match. Maybe we had transactions showing up in the remittance that weren't showing up in the transaction. And maybe you want to request a copy of an invoice. So I can click on maybe one of these unmatched lines, hit request copy, and from there, I can then type in a subject. The statement will be attached to the email, and I can ask what it is that I would like to be resent. Maybe an invoice was delivered with the goods and it never made it up to finance. Maybe you want to use this as a prime tool for imploring your suppliers to email their invoices through rather than sending them paper-based, either with the goods or via mail. A few options there. But if I come in and mark that as reconciled, that then once again can disappear from my tile. So this can be used for one of two reasons. One, it can be purely used just as keeping track of those statements and double checking things aren't slipping through the cracks. But you can also use that reconciliation process to reduce paying of invoices that haven't come in via statement. So those that are familiar with processing accounts payable and payment selections, there's a select payment screen that most would be, from a finance perspective, would already be familiar with. But if I come in and select eDocs supplier payments, my screen gets a little bigger and I've got a few more options. So within here, you do have the option of putting in similar highest pay dates that you might be familiar with, but this time you can create your own invoice selection. So you'll notice that I've got some branch options. Maybe I've got a supplier type, invoices below a certain dollar value. I can keep adding selections, and this uses the selection criteria that you might be familiar with if you've used approvals and alerts before. But there's quite a lot of flexibility on how you can limit those transactions. So you could also only include ones that have been reconciled if that was an appropriate response as well. So if I come in and say, well, I'm after branch 10 and invoices less than $2,000, apply, that'll go through and find all the transactions that meet that criteria. So not too many, just the one in this example. I can see quite a bit of information around that. So I can see not only the invoice and the invoice number, what's outstanding. I can see the purchase order number. I can also see if it's been applied to a statement and it's been reconciled. So you do have additional options to create payment selections around this tool as well. So we've got some clients that have gone down the eDoc payment selection concept purely for the additional invoice selection criteria, just to add some additional features above and beyond the standard AP payment selections. Okay, so what we might do is you might throw it out to the audience for some Q&A on what we've gone through so far. So let's go have a look at the questions. So one of the questions so far is scraping available for job cost timesheets and or plant charge entries? Also, what about payroll information? Can it be scraped? So at this stage, scraping isn't available for all transaction types and nor is eDocs. There's a limited range of types. If I just bring up the type area just as a quick. So we've got the ability of bringing in AP credit notes and AP invoices. We've got the ability of doing AP statements as well as potentially AR remittances if need be. We can do credit card and expense claims as well as the expense receipts that match. We can do purchase orders or purchase order receipts. So if you do get things like delivery dockets and such that you wish to bring in, we can handle that also. We can also do service requests or support calls. So at this point in time, timesheets and plant charges are currently not available within eDocs, but if you did have a specific need or requirement, there is the ability of adding additional types here. An extractor can be used for a range of different scraping requirements. So what I would recommend, if you're interested in any one of those areas, then of course get in contact with your star consultant to talk about the possible options within eDocs. But also, if you were interested in non-standard, then once again get in contact with your consultant, and we can start the conversation.
Another question that's come up: is there a list of file formats that are acceptable for eDocs and scraping?
There sure is. So you can use a range of different file formats. So we can use Word documents, we can use Excel spreadsheets, we can scan PDFs and image formats. So things like JPEGs, PNGs, and such. Another question from coming through: what version of Greentree is required to access eDocs functionality? So eDocs has been around for a little while now. Different features have been added over time. So it's a little hard to say exactly. It's probably an easier question to answer when looking at a specific version. So at a specific version number, what is available. So what I would suggest, if once again, if you are interested in getting a better look at eDocs, is get in contact with your star consultant, potentially talk about what version you're on. I can only assume by that question that potentially you might be on a slightly older version of Greentree. So yeah, definitely ask the question, and we can look at getting you a better idea of what functionality is available at your current version, and if you are looking at additional functionality, which version of Greentree you would need to get to that point.
Okay, another question that's come up: can you match an AP invoice to a shipment receipt?
You sure can. Yep. So a shipment receipt simply creates a standard purchase order receipt within Greentree. So that would definitely be available to select via the AP invoice eDoc.
Okay, that looks like all the questions we've got for the moment. But
is there or will there be a phone app to work with eDocs? So at this stage, the short answer to that question is not a specific app, so no. However, we do have it that you can email documents through. Those documents via email. So usually that relates to things like expense receipts. So someone out on the road, maybe they've got some parking expenses, some meal vouchers, etc., that they want to take, or a taxi receipt. They can take a photo of that and email that through to, for example, expenses@ecomputersaustralia.com or whatever the appropriate email address is. We can look at the subject line and body of that email to potentially look at either A, pre-coding, or just leaving a little bit of information for that user to then code at a later stage. But at this point in time, there is no app to work specifically with eDocs. Now, Greentree does have an API, so that's definitely something we could look at working with you around your specific requirements. We've done a number of web development items with existing clients, not in this specific area, but it is definitely something available to us if that's an area you would like to go further or look into. So once again, I guess I reiterate, if you've got a non-standard or non-out-of-the-box eDocs requirement, don't hesitate to get in contact with your consultant, and potentially that we could look at either A, thinking outside the box a little bit, or B, looking at custom or design work around your specific requirements. Some good questions so far.
Hmm.
So if you do have any more questions, obviously feel free to keep shooting them through. With a little bit of leftover time, I thought I might show you through eDocs Expense Manager. So the idea behind eDocs Expense Manager is users can then, let me just switch desktop a little bit. Users can email through receipts throughout the weeks or month. You can then code those within Greentree. You can either have the users log in and code them, or alternatively, a finance user or account clerk could potentially be doing the coding process. So if I was just to bring up one of these examples, so let's just look at this taxi receipt. So the screen is similar to what we've been looking at so far within eDocs. So I've got the receipt on the right-hand side here. Now, depending on how this photo was taken, on what device, etc., you might have a situation where this comes in on its side. You do have some standard rotate clockwise, anti-clockwise to make this a little easier to have a look at. Within this, we create what we call expense types. Now, this is a list that you can control, and depending on that expense type, that can limit what GL accounts or other transaction line types show up within the main tab here. We've got the ability of keeping track of both the value and then selecting the lines. So you can take one receipt and split that across multiple line types. Alternatively, you can come in and also just create one from scratch as well if need be. So if you do have a situation where maybe it's mileage or something like that, you can come in and create an expense receipt directly with it, without having a physical document to look at. Now, we do have, as I said before, the ability of doing thresholds. So a little bit of a quick snapshot. I won't go into too many setup screens, but if I quickly look at my expense item screen, this is where you can set up your categories into groups and subgroups. And so if I look at, for example, taxi, we can have things like receipt value thresholds, reasonable value thresholds, and what do you do if those thresholds are met, whether those are errors or warnings. So if you do have situations where maybe your staff can claim their meals while traveling, but maybe only up to a certain point. If they want to go to a fancy restaurant, then by all means, but you'll only receipt up to a certain dollar amount. That's where these thresholds can really come into play. And then how or what types of lines you're allowed to select. So in this example, I've got a type called travel expenses. When it comes to actually doing my credit card or expense claim, the process is similar, but let's just jump over to expenses. This is where I can have a look at all my unallocated receipts. So these are what I was just showing on my workflow desktop. If I click on one of these, it quickly shows you what it is in case I was trying to remember what it related to. I can split this into two if needed, or I can come in here and, as I said, add a blank line. So if I was claiming mileage, then one option is to take a photo of your odometer. The other option is to simply come in, hit add blank line, and then potentially selecting the expense type mileage, and then putting in the appropriate quantities, whether that's kilometers and such. So if I do come in and just select a couple of those and hit add to my expense claim, that'll then go through. It'll mark which ones were outside of the exceptions and which ones were within, and that can then go through an approval process and finally create a supplier invoice, which is how expense claims are paid. With statements, we do have the ability of matching bringing those transactions in from a CSV also to do the matching. So a number of options around that. is there an implementation program available for the setup? So I read that question as is there implementation required for using these modules? Yes, there would be, depending on the eDoc type. A different level of setup is required. So, for example, eDocs Expense Manager, there's the setup of all the different expense types, where they're going to post to, what accounts are allowed to be selected, and so on. Whereas within eDocs supplier invoices, we can speed that process up a little bit more, depending on just how many supplier types that we went through a little earlier. AP supplier statements is a much quicker and easier eDoc module to turn on and implement with very little required setup options around that, because it's reading a statement and then matching to the transactions. But those other ones have a little bit more work around them, depending on, once again, the level of detail or the level of different options you have. Can we use Expense Manager without using timesheets? You sure can. Yeah, so Expense Manager is not linked to timesheets in any way. So it simply is creating supplier invoices against a supplier linked to that user. Hypothetically, if you did have the older e-timesheets module still in use, which does allow for expense transactions through there, you could still look at the invoice gets created, no different. We could potentially look at handling approvals through that module if that's an area you're already using, if need be. How well does eDocs work with multiple branches, profit centers? If you want to split an invoice against multiple profit centers, will it remember the split for future invoices? For example, utility bills across the 3 profit centers each time. So I'll just quickly jump back to that supplier invoice eDocs desktop and just bring one up. So let's go with this insurance house one, for example. So if you're using the line level and you wish to split that across 3 types, then by default, as you select a line, it will just be the one GL account, so the one profit center or branch per line scanned. So as far as then auto remembering that utility bill split as 25, 25, 50 across the 3 profit centers, it won't do that out of the box. But one of the things you can do with standard Greentree is use the under General Ledger, you can use the allocation maintenance to potentially do that split. Now, the way you could use that is you could create a specific accrual account or clearing account, sorry, I should say, for this supplier, so that amount can go to that one account, and then using standard GL allocation, split out your 3 ways across the profit centers each time. That would then speed that process up. It would also give a little bit more of an audit trail or security around who can change that percentage split. Okay, so that's eDocs. One of the things that we just wanted to also show is that there are a number of videos currently available, which you can find through STAR's YouTube page. So there's some videos on a number of the different types we went through today, and more are being added as time goes on. Some of those videos will be directly from MYOB, and other videos will be created by STAR as and when we require.
So to find those, if you type in Star Business Solutions on YouTube, and around about the middle of the page, you'll see a tab called Playlists. You'll need to click on those and open up all of the playlists. Unfortunately, I haven't got those sitting on our YouTube front page at the moment, but if you go to the playlist and look under demonstration video playlists for Greentree, you'll find all of those. The 5 that are listed there now are already up and active. I think the minimum one's about 10 or 15 minutes long, so they do go into a lot more detail than Josh has had the time for today.
One last question before we dive on then, is do most customers require much assistance in the setup from Star? It depends on the customer, but on the most part, eDocs is a very easy tool to get up and running. As far as things like traditional setup screens, like for example, module control type settings, there's very little required there. The setup is more around those supplier types I was talking about, and depending on which eDoc modules you go with, things like those expense item types as well. So that's definitely something that there's documentation on, and you can create yourselves. So we can really reduce the amount of assistance required from Star to get those modules in and up and running.
Okay, last chance for any questions. No, it looks like that's it. Okay, well, I'd just like to say thanks to Josh for today's presentation. I'd also like to thank all of you for joining our webinar today. A copy of the recording for this webinar will be emailed out to everyone sometime within the next 24 hours. If you do have any questions specific to your requirements, please feel free to contact your consultant who looks after you on a day-to-day basis. If they're unable to help, then they can refer through to Josh. He has a lot of creative ideas on how to put things together that may not be technically obvious in the manuals. So there's more ways to skin a cat than you might believe, and so please feel free to talk to your consultant, or if you wish to talk to one of our BDMs, then by all means do so. So once again, thank you, and in 2 months' time we'll have another webinar.